Welcome to the Daily Grace Podcast. Here at the Daily Grace Co., our mission is to equip disciples in the Word. We believe that deep Bible study and rich theology are not just for the seminary student or pastor, but they are accessible for all believers. We hope these conversations will invite you into a deeper relationship with the Lord and to remind you that the gospel changes everything.
Before this episode starts, I want to let you know that this conversation includes discussion of sensitive topics, including stillbirth, grief, and loss. We encourage you to care for your heart as you listen, pause if needed, and seek support if this content feels heavy. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Daily Grace Podcast. My name is Shelby and I'm so excited that you're here and that I get to introduce you to our guest for today, Ashley Opliger. Hi Ashley, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're excited for this conversation today. If you don't know who Ashley is, she is an author, a podcaster, and the executive director of Bridget's Cradles. And Ashley, when I was prepping for this podcast and just like getting to know you through your online presence, one thing really stood out to me about you. And that is that in big, bold letters on your website, it says, Jesus has carried me through the deepest valleys of loss and heartbreak. And we all in our lives will walk through valleys of loss and heartbreak, whether we already have or whether we will in the future. So to have someone who has been through that, who's willing to share their story vulnerably and is willing to share how Jesus carried them through that season is so valuable, because those are the times when we wonder, where is God and am I going to make it through? So we're just really glad to have you here today to share your message.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And yes, if you go to my website or on my Instagram, you'll see a lot of content related to grief and suffering. And certainly that's not something that I thought that I would end up being known for as the grief girl. But I think through all the trials in my life, I've been well acquainted with suffering. And so what I hope to share is that my identity is not in my trials, but in Jesus, who has brought me through the trials and has brought beauty from them. And so I'm excited to share more of my testimony with you and all your listeners today.
Yeah, love that. So today, specifically, we're going to be talking about your book, which recently released and is called Cradled in Hope, Trusting Jesus to Heal Your Heart as He Holds Your Baby in Heaven. And I'm wondering if, just to get us started, you can tell us a little bit about your story and what led to you writing the book Cradled in Hope.
Yeah. So my husband and I, we were expecting our first baby. And we had just recently been married and we were excited to start a family and grow a family. And both of us had always wanted to be parents. And so when we found out we were expecting so soon after getting married, we were just delighted and ready to get the nursery ready and everything like that. And everything was pretty normal in my first trimester of pregnancy, but around 13 weeks, I started having very heavy bleeding and I was hospitalized. I was told I had a subchorionic hemorrhage and I was put on bed rest. And so I ended up being on bed rest for about 11 weeks. And then I had a placental abruption at 24 weeks, 5 days. And that's when I went into labor. And unfortunately, our daughter, Bridget Faith, was stillborn. So she was already in the arms of Jesus when she was delivered. But in the midst of this heartbreak and trauma, all of the, just overwhelming grief that you experience when you go to the hospital and deliver a baby who is not born alive. It just, in the midst of that, we felt the presence of the Lord in the hospital room, and we felt the peace that our daughter's soul was in heaven. We were going to see her again. And in all of that, we had this little precious mint green cradle that my mom had knit. She was trying to make a little blanket for Bridget when I was on bed rest, and she kept thinking, if Bridget's born early and she's in the NICU, she'll need a tiny little blanket. But then God really gave her the idea to knit the sides up and turn it into a cradle so that it would hold such a tiny baby more snugly. And so we just had this beautiful little cradle that held her in a very dignified yet functional way. And that really changed everything for us. We had 24 hours to hold her in the cradle. Both of our families were able to hold her and love on her. And then shortly after leaving the hospital, my mom, being that she was a postpartum nurse, she heard from the hospital staff, we've never seen anything like this little cradle. We really would like to have more of these for babies that are born into heaven in the second trimester. And so we started a ministry, and we have been doing this now for 10 years.
Wow. I know you got to share just a little bit about that with me before we started, but it's so incredible to me when out of your grief and suffering, you can turn that around and use that to help others who are kind of in that place. And I know that one of the things that you talk about is giving yourself time to grieve, because we're often encouraged to rush past that, just kind of our culture. That's the norm, or maybe even an expectation we have of ourselves, or maybe others have of it. But you've talked about how important it is to allow yourself time and space to grieve. Would you want to talk about why we need that time and space?
Yeah. Well, first of all, our culture is very uncomfortable with grief and sitting in other people's sadness. And so there's a lot of times an external pressure, a cultural pressure to move on and to move past your grief, because other people expect you to be back to normal and acting like your old self. And when you go through trials, the grief of losing a baby, you're never going to be the same that you were before. A lot of moms will refer to it as a new normal. And so it's hard when everybody that loves you wants you to be back to who you were before. And life has changed now, and you're going to be different yourself, and God's going to grow you in your grief. But also there's just going to be this new normal of walking through life with ache and sorrow in your heart. And so first of all, there's that pressure, but then there's the internal pressure. Grieving is painful. And I know that sounds overly simplistic to say, but a lot of times when we feel pain, we don't want to feel that pain. It's uncomfortable. And so a lot of times we will try to numb it or distract ourselves from that pain. I know I'm very good at that. I'll keep myself busy, and even busy with good things. And, that's not negative coping mechanisms, but even good things can become distractions in grief if we are trying to avoid feeling those emotions. And I think it is so important to let ourselves feel those emotions, because I don't believe that we can find healing without feeling and grieving first. And it's really a continual process. It's not stages that we walk through. It's grieving and then healing and grieving and healing, and just kind of cyclical in that way. And so I think it's really important, even though the world wants us to move on, even there's that pressure inside of us of we don't want to feel this, we just want to feel better. But it's so important to give yourself time to sit in that sadness with Jesus and let him work on your heart and heal those broken places. So it's hard to do, but it's so important, because I think if we distract ourselves or we push it down, it's just going to delay our healing. And it's really all of those emotions are going to surface in other ways.
Yeah. You talk about like numbing or avoiding or delaying. And I think people are most familiar and probably most often use those things when they're experiencing pain or grief. And so this idea of sitting in it or processing through it is more foreign. Do you think you could give us just any like practical tips? Like, what does it look like to sit in that or to process through your grief rather than to avoid or distract yourself from it?
Yeah. So I write about that in my book. I actually just have a section about what does it mean to grieve and what does that look like. And it looks like different for each person. And so anything that I share here in my book is not meant to be a checklist. I think sometimes we fall into that of, we need to do these things to get better. And really each person's grieving journey is very unique. But I think, first of all, starting with crying and lamenting, a lot of times it can feel hard to just let yourself have time to cry, like scheduling time to cry. If you feel uncomfortable crying around other people, just having space where you're alone with the Lord and you can cry, whether it's in the safety of your own bedroom or out at their gravestone, wherever it is, just having a place to express those emotions. Tears are one way to let the grief out. And I feel like anytime that I let myself cry and just give myself into my emotions, there's always this like relief and release, through that afterwards. But also it could look like worship. It could look like journaling, sitting down and writing prayers to God, or just writing out your emotions and feelings. And for me, I had a little journal that I wrote in letters to Bridget, just kind of, what I would have said if she were here, and just processing all the hopes and the dreams that I had for her. That was really healing for me in the early days after she went to heaven. So it can look a lot of different ways. But I think what's important is just having alone time where it's quiet. You're not on your phone. You're not, distracted by something. It could be just sitting with your Bible and reading the Psalms. Those are a perfect place to start, because those are the just lamenting and crying out, "Where are you, God? I've been sitting on my couch with tears and I don't see you. I don't feel you in this." I feel like David's words are so comforting, because that's what we feel when we're grieving. And so getting in the Word, worshiping, even if you don't feel like you have the strength to sing the words, just let the words wash over you, lift up your hands and surrender. Those can be very healing ways to grieve.
Yeah. You said something a minute ago that I think resonates with anyone who's gone through a difficult season, a grief-filled season, which is, "Where are you, Lord?" It can feel like God is distant in those seasons. And so is that something that you have wrestled with, this feeling of being abandoned by God in your grief? And if you have wrestled with that, how do you wrestle through that? How do you come out the other side of wrestling with such a big question like that?
Yeah, I have an entire chapter about feeling abandoned by God, and there's some threads throughout the book of those questions of who God is and our grief, and when we feel forsaken and left by Him, and why is He allowing this? Why would a good God allow babies to die? All of these hard theological questions that are natural to come up and affect our faith walk with Jesus, because if we ultimately feel as though He's doing something to punish us, or He's doing something out and He doesn't love us because of that, obviously those are errors in our theology, and that's something I talk about in the book a lot. But those things are going to impact our walk with Him and our relationship with Him. And so it's important to wrestle with those things and to bring them to the Lord. If we truly feel abandoned by Him, we want to take that to Him rather than run from Him. And so I talk a lot about how I really discovered in my grieving process all of these errors in my theology of believing that God was only good if He blessed me, and that if I walked through trials that He must not love me, or that He must not care for me. And, that's bad theology. And obviously there's so many of us, we wouldn't necessarily say that's what we believe, but when trials come, we have those feelings. And so it's a difference between our head knowledge and what we feel in our heart. So for me, I knew God was good, but in my heart, He didn't feel good, because how could He be good if this happened? And so what really changed for me was studying the nature of God in God's Word and knowing the truth of His character, and then seeing my circumstances through the lens, basically seeing God through the lens of my circumstances, which was skewing my perception of God, and choosing to see my circumstances through the lens of God's nature. And I have an entire section in my book about that shift and how that really kind of flips everything on its head, because when we are looking at our circumstances with our emotions, which are not truth, our feelings, that can get us down a dangerous road. But when we understand in light of eternity, and that Jesus told us, yes, there will be trials, but He has overcome them. He has overcome the world. We have a different perspective of suffering. And that was really helpful for me in navigating those feelings of Him, has He abandoned me? No, the Word says He is not, and He will not leave me or forsake me. And combating some of those lies with the truth is so important to develop that trust again with Jesus, because He is trustworthy and He's faithful.
Yeah, man, I think you just said something that's so important. And I think every Christian will have to wrestle with that at some point, which is, am I allowing my circumstances to define who God is, or am I allowing who God is to define my circumstances? And until you've kind of walked through that season, it might even be hard to see well, what's the difference there? How does it change things? So, even wondering if you have a specific example. Is there a circumstance that was shaping your view of God, and what truth of God then kind of reshaped how you saw that circumstance?
Yeah, so to use a recent example, so after we lost Bridget in 2014, I started the ministry, and we grew the nonprofit over the last 10 years, and we're now sending the cradles to 1,600 hospitals in all 50 states and send out 30,000 cradles a year. And I've been leading support groups and grief, gatherings and things like that. And so felt like I was very acquainted with grief and healing and had been leading our podcast, Cradled in Hope, wrote the book. And in the midst of all of that, as I was writing the book and had just turned my first manuscript in, my dad was hit by a drunk driver while he was riding his motorcycle. And he lived for a week, and he went to heaven on August 4th of last year. And that has been arguably the hardest trial I've ever walked through, and the deepest grief and the most traumatic experience I've walked through. And so even though I had done so much healing with the Lord through the loss of my daughter and had really walked so many other people through grief, it was a whole new grief that I had not known before. And at this point, I'm writing books on grief and theology and suffering and all of this. And I was walking through the loss of my dad and realized that I had been believing something about him. And it finally was like, once that came out of me and I verbalized it, there was a day that I just said out loud to God, I said, "You're so cruel." And that's obviously not true. He's not cruel. But I was letting my emotions of seeing my dad suffer at the hands of someone else's sin and watch just the trauma of what happened to him and what happened to my family after he died. And I just kept thinking, God, you're so cruel. How could you let this happen? Why would you let him be in the path of such a reckless driver? And I just struggled with that. And it wasn't until I said the words out loud, "You're so cruel," that God could reveal his character to me and show me gently and correct that feeling in me. And I was actually out in Denver. I went to a grief intensive, a counseling intensive out there for this. And I was out there, it happened to be Holy Week. I went to a church I'd never been to before for Good Friday service. And they had this beautiful reverent service where they had the Last Supper table set, and they had violins playing and just this beautiful worship music. And as I was just imagining Jesus at the table, the Last Supper, and then walking into what he endured on the cross, his crucifixion, I just was weeping. And I was imagining him on the cross as I was sitting there. And I just felt this overwhelming sense in my spirit. He is anything but cruel. He has endured cruelness for us so that we could live forever, so that my dad could live forever, and I'll see him again. And I just, as I took communion that night, I just kept praising him for my dad's salvation, that, that humans can kill the body, but Jesus has my dad's soul. And it just really was so impactful to me to be like, he is not cruel. He is weeping over this with me. He did not want this to happen to my dad. He is grieved over the sin of this man that did this. And he is a just God, and he will have justice for this. And ultimately, the justice that I pray is that this man finds Jesus and can one day meet my dad in heaven. And so it's been a journey, to say the least, and I'm still on the journey, because forgiveness, I think, is a continual surrender. But to answer your question, I think for me, it was being brave enough to be honest with God, to tell him how I really felt, and allowing him to speak kindly to me, to show me his character. And I think something that I said in my dad's eulogy was, watching my dad suffer and die at the hands of a drunk driver was the closest I'll ever get to Calvary. And granted, my dad, was not the Messiah. He was not a sinless man as Jesus was and is. But it was the closest thing for my earthly father to be suffering for someone else. And so when I imagine that Jesus did this for me willingly while I was still a sinner and for humankind, he is anything but cruel. He is so good. He's so faithful, and I'm so grateful for him. And so that was just how he revealed his character to me in a very loving way. It wasn't like he was like mad at me that I had these feelings. He welcomed my questions, my doubts, my anger, my fear, all of these things. He welcomes those things. And I think that's something that people have a hard time wrestling with God, because they fear that he's going to judge you for doubting or judge you for being angry with him about something. And it's like, he already knows our thoughts. He already knows that. And all of that sin has already been taken care of at the cross. So he welcomes us, and he just wants us to come home to him and bring it to him, and he will take care of us and walk us through our journey. As I said, just through the valley, he's our good shepherd. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's the most recent example I can think of.
No, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. What a powerful story. I think two things that you said that really stuck out to me are, you said that you allowed yourself to be honest about what you were really feeling and thinking about God, even when you said like, you are so cruel. I think, we talked about like avoiding and distracting. I think sometimes we try to avoid those really scary big thoughts that we have about God that maybe go against, like you said, what our head knows to be true, but our heart is struggling to feel. But then you also said that you allowed God to speak kindly to you in response to that. And so just the softness and the openness of heart on both fronts to be like, just very vulnerably, like, here's where I'm at, but I'll like allow you to just speak to me truth in this moment. I think that's going to be a really, really helpful thing for a lot of people who find themselves in a dark place. I want to get your perspective on another thing that grieving parents, and maybe even mainly grieving mothers after the loss of a child, struggle with. And it's wondering if they did something wrong. I know that there's someone personally in my life who recently experienced infant loss, and this is something that she's asked for prayer for multiple times. And so what would you say to a mom who is grieving, who's struggling with blaming herself over what happened?
Yeah, well, I personally experienced this. So even though I couldn't control the subchorionic hemorrhage or the placental abruption because it was my body that failed Bridget, there was this line between body and soul, and it almost became, well, then I failed her, that I failed my daughter. And that was something I really struggled with after I came home without her in my belly anymore. When I would get in the shower, I'd look at my body and I would just feel so much resentment. Like, my body did this to her and my body failed, and am I not good enough to be a mom? And those are lies from the enemy. The Lord would never speak that kind of condemnation over us, that we did something to cause our baby's death or that we're not a good mom. And so, first of all, identifying the lies of the enemy from God's voice, but also just having so much grace, because not only did I experience those feelings of, well, maybe if I would have known to have been on progesterone, would that have prevented the bleeding from happening? All of these what if kind of questions. And I walk with so many women in our support groups. We offer them in person and online. And I know very few women who don't have a what if kind of question. What if I wouldn't have eaten that? What if I wouldn't have gone on this long car ride? What if I would have noticed that my baby's movements hadn't, decreased that day and we would have gone in sooner? There's so many different things that I have heard from mothers. And the thing that I always come back to is that if you could have saved your baby, you would have. I know any mom that I've talked to, if they could have, they would have. And so that is what makes you a good mom. You cannot blame yourself for things that you didn't know and that you couldn't control. And that's really hard as a mom, because we feel as though our job is to nurture and to protect. And there are simply certain things that are outside of our control to change and within our bodies. And there's certain things that we don't know at the time. For me, I ended up having 2 other little boys, and I was on progesterone in those pregnancies, and they were both full term and healthy. And so after having them, I kept thinking, well, if I would have been on progesterone, maybe this would have been a different outcome. But I didn't know to be on progesterone until after everything happened with Bridget. And so why am I blaming myself for having knowledge later that happened because of going through that experience that I wouldn't have known then? And something that really has helped me with giving myself grace and speaking kindly to myself is extending the same grace that I would a friend. If a friend came to me and said, I'm really struggling with this, I feel as though I wish I would have noticed this, or I would have done this, or would have done that. My response to her would have been the same thing. You didn't know what you didn't know. You couldn't have controlled this. You are a good mom. You loved your baby so much. You continue to love your baby so much. If you could have saved them, you would have. That's what I would say to another mom. And so if you can imagine someone else, if you're listening to this and you're struggling with these feelings, if you can imagine someone else telling your story to you from their mouth, what would you say to them? I guarantee you there would be a lot more compassion and love and grace, and trying to then speak to yourself that way. And I know that can be so hard, but it can be so healing if you can just release the self-blame and the shame and the guilt and the regret, and know that you are a good mom, and that Jesus speaks those words over you as well. And that if you're hearing anything but that in your mind, that is not from God, that is from the enemy.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that encouragement. I know that that will be probably really helpful for many moms to hear. I'm thinking about those listening who haven't experienced a miscarriage or infant loss, but there's someone close to them who has. And they might find themselves unsure of how to care for that person, how to talk about loss with that person, whether it's something that happened recently or maybe it happened years ago. And so do you have any advice for those who are walking alongside grieving mothers and families?
Yes, I do. And our ministry also has a free ebook on our website specific for this, because we have had so many people asking the same question of, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to give them. And so we put together an entire ebook with ideas on how to love and support them through it. And then also a gift guide with various ideas on what you could give to them in memory of a baby. But to summarize that, everything that's in that ebook, I would say the most important thing is just the ministry of presence, of being willing to step into their grief with them. As we talked about before, it's a lot of people are very uncomfortable with grief and sadness. And so a lot of times people who are grieving feel very alone, especially as the weeks turn into months and the months turn into years. The people that are there to support them will kind of drop off over time. And so just being someone that consistently is willing to engage and just ask questions, how are you doing? How are you really doing? And being willing to sit and listen to them cry, and just be not someone that needs to fix their pain or offer solutions, but just willing to sit and hear what's on their heart and remember their baby with them. And so that's, a generalized, the main advice that I would give. But to be more practical, I would say, especially in the early days after grief, if you can meet physical needs, whether that's bringing a meal or helping them with different things around their house or errands, things like that can be really helpful, because those early weeks of grief are just so overwhelming. You're in survival mode. It feels like you can barely take care of yourself, let alone other people in your family and your house. And so offering to come and meet those needs and being very specific about what you're offering, because, even though it's very well-meaning to say, let me know if you need anything, or please let me know how I can help, it's kind of hard for the grieving person to take you up on that, because they don't want to feel needy. And so if you can say something like, I would like to bring you dinner on this day or this day, which day is better? I'd like to do this or that. Which one would be better for you right now? Usually people will take you up on that. But also just remembering their baby, whether it's Mother's Day or Christmas or the different holidays, their baby's due date and their baby's heaven day. If you can send them a card or a text, something that just says, I see you, I remember your baby with you, that's so important as well.
Yeah, those are all really great practical ideas. And we'll be sure and link that ebook as well in the show notes so that people can check that out. Ashley, I know that one thing that you say is that your perspective on eternity changed after losing Bridget. And so I'm wondering, how does the eternal perspective that you have now, how has that changed? And then how does that just influence your daily life?
Yeah, well, I'm excited to go to heaven. I think the more that I've studied about heaven scripturally, the more that I'm excited to be there. I have a section in my book called Homesick for Heaven, and it's just this idea of, we weren't made for this earth and the brokenness of this world. And certainly when you lose a baby, you see that more than ever. This is, not the natural of order things. Death itself is not natural. And so, God didn't intend for us to birth death or to even have to experience death. But because of the fall and sin in the world, we have death as part of it. But one day we will live on the new earth without death and sin, and mourning and crying and pain, for the old order of things has passed away, Revelation 21. And so I think for me, I've just been so excited to know that all this suffering, all this pain, all the grief, all the tears, all of that will be no more at one point, and our tears will be wiped away. And once we're in heaven, we'll be there for eternity with with Jesus, our Savior, with our loved ones in Christ, with our babies. And that is just so exciting to me because it really has not only losing a child, but then losing my dad in such a sudden way has made me realize that our lives really are but a vapor. This time on earth is literally just a blip in our eternal, lives. And so I think for me, I've had more of an urgency to share the gospel and to live for Jesus on my time on earth because I realize, first of all, I'm not guaranteed tomorrow. I'm not even guaranteed my next breath, but also because there's work to do. And once I'm in heaven, we won't be evangelizing anymore. We'll be with Jesus forever. And so I think it has changed how I want to live because I think once I really understood the gospel of, this amazing gift of salvation that we have, it's made me want to just glorify God and to do good works for him, not to earn my salvation, not to feel like I need to do that to get to heaven, but just out of gratitude that I love Jesus so much, I want to serve him. And so I think for me, the hope of heaven has really stirred in me just a heart for serving and for building the kingdom, because I know that nothing that we build on this earth, money, things, all that, like we can't take any of it with us. And so the best currency that we have is a heavenly currency and the treasures that we're storing up, and most importantly, the glory that we're giving Jesus. So I think it's changed my perspective and how I live and just given me more of an urgency and an understanding that, this life is but a vapor. It's so short, and soon and very soon I'll be home in heaven and Jesus could come back before then. And so I think too, just that expectation for his return and longing for that and hoping to see that in my lifetime. But if not, whenever I take my last breath, knowing what's to come is so much better than where we are here. And it's actually very biblical to long for heaven. It's not, some people think it's weird that, I'm so excited about going to heaven that I wasn't made for this broken world, and being excited about what's to come.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think those are such great reminders for all of us when it's so easy to get swept up into the here and now that we have the hope of heaven in front of us. Ashley, 2 more questions to wrap up this interview. The first one is, if there was someone in front of you who's just in the deepest, darkest moments of grief and loss, maybe they've lost a child or maybe they're grieving in a different way, what words of hope would you want to share with them?
Yeah, so many things. But I think the first thing, if she was sitting right in front of me, would just be being present with her and letting her feel seen and known by me, but most importantly by God, that God is with her in this. I think that's one of the things the enemy really wants for the grieving and just any believer, is to feel like they're alone, that they don't have, that the Lord has forsaken them, that there's not people around them that love them to carry them through this. And so I think there's such power in knowing that Jesus sees you, that he loves you, he's with you in this, he has not forsaken you, but also that there's a body around you, the body of Christ that's surrounding you, and that you don't have to walk through this alone. We talk so much about the hope of heaven and all of these amazing things that are to come, this abundant life that we're promised in heaven, but there's also an abundant life that he's promised us here on earth. And it can look really hard to think, well, where is that abundant life when you're grieving and you're suffering and you feel like, I can't even see out of the darkness of this tunnel. I don't know how I'm going to get through this current trial. I have been there. I've been in that tunnel many times. And in some ways, I feel like I'm still in it. So I understand what it's like to be in those dark, deep places, but having other believers around you that are here to support you, to love you, to walk you through this, and knowing that Jesus is with you in the tunnel, that he's going to lead you through that valley, and there is light at the end of it, and that in that grieving process, there's actually so much to learn about him and about yourself, and he's sanctifying you in that. And it's crazy to say this, but in every valley that I've ever been through is when the most growth and the most my faith has been strengthened. My character has been, just grown through the suffering and trials. I think that's when he can really mold us into his likeness and prune us and all of that sanctification work. And it's not fun. It's not easy. It's not always the sanctification journey, but I have just felt like through suffering, I have known Jesus like I've never known him before. And he's grown me as a woman and as a follower of Jesus. And so my prayer for the woman that's in that season would be, this is not a wasted season, that the Lord is working in you and he will work through you and he will lead you out of this valley.
Yeah, those are such hopeful words. Thank you. So last question, Ashley, and this is a question that we ask every guest that we have on the Daily Grace podcast. We say that the gospel changes everything, and we would love to know, Ashley, what has the gospel changed for you?
Yeah, well, I love that phrase. It's actually chapter 3 of my book, The Gospel Changes Everything. So for me, and in that chapter, I kind of walk through what, the gospel and the four, just explaining it in a way that makes sense. But the way that I talk about it as I relate it to pregnancy loss is right now there is a physical separation between my daughter and I because of death. And death has caused this physical separation. And that's what the grieving is. It's this, I want to be with her again and she's not here. And so for me and for any believer, the gospel changes everything because the gospel is the solution to the separation. And, when you look at the gospel itself is that, mankind, we went away from what he had intended for us and there was the fall. But because Jesus died on the cross, he's made a way back to the Father. And so that separation that was between us and God is no more because Jesus has covered our sins and given us a way to be made righteous before him. And so I kind of use that explanation as the gospel has also been the solution to this separation between us and our babies or our loved ones in Christ, that he has made a way for salvation and for this eternity in heaven. And so for me, it's changed everything because I know that my suffering has an expiration date, that my grief is only for a time because I will see my daughter again. I will see my dad again. And so even though I'm grieving with hope. And that's the difference with the gospel, is that we are grieving with hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel. And so the gospel changes everything because it's eternity with him and with our loved ones again. And one day everything will be made right. And what more could we ever ask or imagine, could we ever want in our grief? So I'm just thankful that death has been defeated and there is a cure for death and that we're not separated forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yes. I feel like that's the reminder that we all need. Well, thank you guys for listening today. If you want to connect with Ashley, you want to check out her book, Cradled in Hope, or get the free ebook that she mentioned, we'll have all those things linked for you in the show notes. And while you're in the show notes, you can also subscribe to the podcast newsletter to stay up to date with all things Daily Grace Podcast. Ashley, it's been such a joy to have you here. Just so encouraged by the ministry that you're doing and the people that you are reaching and your willingness to share the hard parts of your story, but also the ways that God has met you in it. So just thank you for being here today.
Of course. Thank you so much.
All right, guys. We'll see you next time.